fluids and electrolytes, imbalances, and disturbances. So, for the first learning objectives is to differentiate between osmosis, diffusion, filtration, and active transport. So, for the overview of physiology, an imbalance of fluid or electrolyte levels is recognized as a threat to life. Never before has the nurse's responsibility for electrolyte and fluids administration and monitoring been more intense. And this applies to all clinical settings in which care is delivered. Patient outcomes depend in a large part of specialty practice skills, which are based on the sound knowledge of physiology, on particular of fluid and electrolyte interplay. Understanding fluid and electrolyte balance begins with understanding the intake, output, and utilization of water and electrolytes. Regulating mechanisms includes osmosis, diffusion, filtration, and active transport, all of which affect the movement of water and electrolytes within the body. So, diffusion and osmosis are the example of passive transport. That means that the molecules doesn't need the energy to move. Alright, let's start with the definition of the diffusion. Is the movement of molecules, solutes, or particles from a region of high concentration to a region of lower concentration. So, as you can see in the diagram, here we're looking at the diffusion of solutes in a beaker of water. Solute is the substances that can dissolve in water. What should come to our mind is the salt and sugar are the common solutes that you can think of. So in this case, you can see red molecules represent as the sugar molecules. So this represent a region of higher concentrations, and these sugar molecules are going to start to spread to the water around it where there is a lower concentration. So eventually, the sugar molecules are these just spread off and fill out the whole water until you get pretty much a sugar water solution. So the key things you need to know about diffusion: the process did not require energy to move molecules, so it's a passive process. And diffusion involves both gases and liquids. So it can occur in the air. So for instance, if I spray a perfume in a one corner of the room, eventually those perfume molecules are gonna spread out and fill the entire room. And we also have liquids that currently I just explained the examples. Another thing you need to know about diffusion is that the process does not require a semi-permeable membrane to occur, although it commonly would require a semi-permeable membrane in our body in terms of the cell, because the cell have a semi-permeable membrane, which is the cell membrane. So most of these processes that occur in our body will be happening across a semi-permeable membrane, but it is not absolutely necessary for diffusion to occur in general. So I just give an example of molecules dissolve and diffusing in a liquid. There is no semi-permeable membrane involved of that process. So always remember, yes, often it would occur across a semi-permeable membrane in our cells, but generally speaking, diffusion does not absolutely need a semi-permeable membrane in order for it to occur. And finally, diffusion will occur faster as temperature increases. So just imagine you're increasing the temperature, molecules can begin more active more frequently. So that is an increased process for a small period length of time, pretty much spread out. The higher temperature, the faster the molecules to move around and the faster the diffusion to occur. So for the example of diffusion, oxygen and carbon dioxide leaving and entering the lungs. The second example is the nutrients moving across the small intestines and into blood absorption. And the third example is the nutrients and waste materials moving across placenta in a pregnant mother's wombs. All of this process occurs in diffusions. So let's go to the osmosis. So osmosis means is the movement of water molecules only from a dilute solution, more water solution, to a concentrated solution, less water concentrations. Think about osmosis as a special part of diffusion, but it's only concerned with the movement of water molecules. So as you can see in a diagram here, we have a concentrated sugar solution on the left side and a dilute solutions on the right side. So the water molecules on the blue circles and the sugar molecules is the red circles. And we have the semi-permeable membrane in between. So that's a few things to know about osmosis. It requires a semi-permeable membrane. So no energy needed to move a molecule. It requires a semi-permeable membrane to occur, and similar to diffusion, it will occur faster as the temperature increases. So as I said, osmosis is the special type of diffusion, but it only involves water molecules. As you can see in the diagram, water molecules have been moved from the dilute sugar solution, pass across the semi-permeable membrane, and eventually end up in the concentrated sugar solution. So the molecules small enough to pass through, sugar molecules are too big enough to pass through. So eventually the second side that we had in here, dilute solution, pretty much where more water molecules to begin with, that is going to decrease. So you always go from the region where there is a more water concentrated to a region of less water concentrated. So the water would come and fill up the left hand side and make the concentrate to the salt solution side. Hella more diluted, so that is osmosis. So you are going from an area where there is more water to where there is less water across the semi-permeable membrane. So for the example of osmosis is the water from the soil entering plant roots. The second one is water moving across the walls of nephrons in the kidneys. And the third one is the water moving across the small intestine into the blood.
So, this is the continued part of Miss Mara. So, filtration. So, the filtration refers to the movement of solutes and water through selectively permeable membrane. So, always moving from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. So, the filtrations involve the movements of solutes and water in relation to hydrostatic pressure. So the filtrations is the transport of water and dissolved materials through a membrane from an area of higher pressure so to an area of lower pressure so it operates somewhat like a sieve, and the filtrations requires a mechanical pressure. So liquid and solutes are passed through holes in a membrane. So the size of the holes and the differences in the pressures mechanical force. So on each side determine the amount of filtration. So the filtration can be thought of as a pushing pressure because it pushes water and solutes through a membrane from a higher pressure area to a lower pressure area. So filtration through an arterial and the venule filtration is a common in the body. So the blood pressure common in the body, and the blood pressure or the mechanical force so pushes water and small dissolved particles such as the sugars and salts through the capillary walls in the interstitial fluid. So the larger blood cells and the proteins are too large to be pushed through and remain inside the capillaries. So for the next one is the active transport. So the active transport, it is the fluids possibly move from a higher concentration or the pressures to lower concentrations, or the pressure to equalize the concentration on either side of the semi-permeable membrane with osmosis, diffusion, and the filtration. So at times, a higher concentration is required on one side of the membrane than on the other. Active transport is a mechanism that utilize energy to achieve equilibrium. So the active transport has a two types of two types. So this is known as primary and secondary adenosines triphosphate. So is the energy source for a primary active transport, an example of which is the sodium potassium pump. So when there is an increase of sodium concentration within the cell, this is usually activates the pump, and a sodium or the potassium's ion exchange begins. So there are two forms of the secondary active transport, so including the co-transport and the counter-transport. So with the co-transport, the molecule or ion with a higher concentration outside the cell creates a storehouse of energy that will be used for its transport into the cell. So the active transport mechanisms requires specific enzymes and an energy expenditures in the form of the adenosines, triphosphate, which is the ATP. An active transport process can move solutes uphill against the normal rules of the concentration and pressures specific molecules outside a cell. So even if they are fewer in number, it can be assisted into the cell. So even though a greater concentration already exists in the cell. So the best example of the active transport is the sodium potassium pump. So more sodium ion exists so outside in the cell than inside. So the natural tendency would be for a sodium to diffuse across the cellular membrane into the cell. So if the process continued unchecked, however, the homeostatic mechanism which governs nerve transmission and muscles constructions would go berserk. So active transport mechanism figuratively pump out so sodium ion from inside the cell while transporting potassium into the cell. Another example of active transport. So it involves the transport of glucose and amino acids, or which is the proteins. So into the cells lining the small intestine. So the intestinal cells use ATP to create this active transport. So even if the concentration of the solutes would seems to require transport in the opposite directions.
Objective learning number 2. Describe the role of the kidney, lungs, and endocrine glands in regulating the body fluids composition and volume. So, I will explain only the kidney. So, the kidney are essential for regulating the volume and composition of bodily fluids. So, this key regulator system involving the kidney for controlling volume, sodium, and potassium concentration and the pH of bodily fluids. So one way the kidneys can directly control the volume of bodily fluids is by the amount of water excreted in the urine. Either the kidneys can conserve water by producing urine that is concentrated relatively to plasma, or they can rid the body of excess water by producing urine that is dilute relative to plasma. The kidney sends low blood pressure, which is result in lower filtration rates and lower flow through the tubule. This triggers a complex response to raise blood pressure and conserve volume. Kidney function, vital regulation of fluids and electrolyte balance. The kidneys normally filter 180 liters of plasma every day in the adult and excrete 1 to 2 liters of urine according to Inca and Perron 2014. So major function of the kidneys in maintaining normal fluid balance. Regulation of ECF volume and osmolarity by selective retention and excretion of body fluids. ECF means extracellular fluid. How is ECF volume regulated? If ECF volume is to remain constant, the amount of sodium ingested must be matched by the amount of sodium excreted by the kidneys. Osmolality is the concentration of fluid that affects movement of water between fluid compartment. Osmosis. Excretion of body fluids are excreted through the pores as sweat. Regulation of normal electrolyte levels in the ECF by selective electrolyte retention and excretion. Within the extracellular fluid, the major cation is sodium and the major anion is chloride. The major cation in the intracellular fluid is potassium. These electrolytes play an important role in maintaining homeostasis. Regulation of pH of the ECF by retention of hydrogen ions. The pH of the extracellular fluid, including the blood plasma, is normally tightly regulated between 7.32 and 7.42 by the chemicals buffers the respiratory system and the renal system. Excretion of metabolic waste and toxic substances. Metabolic waste of excrement are substances left over from metabolic processes such as cellular respiration, which cannot be used by the organism. They are surplus or toxic and must therefore be excreted. These include nitrogen compound, water, CO2, phosphate, sulfate, and etc. So, given this function, failure of the kidney results in multiple fluid electrolyte abnormalities. Electrolyte abnormalities, symptoms of electrolyte imbalance. The symptoms of electrolyte imbalance are based on which of the electrolyte levels are affected. If your blood test result indicate an altered potassium, magnesium, sodium, or calcium levels, you may experience muscle spasm, weakness, twitching, or conversion.
Number 2, describe the role of the lungs and endocrine glands in regulating the body's fluid composition and volume. Lungs, appropriate lung fluid balance is required for a healthy lung function. Maintenance of fluid balance occurs in through channels, pumps, and pores. These ions transporting proteins are regulated by a variety of protein, enzyme, and second messenger. Altered regulation of ion transporter proteins in the lung epithelium result in impaired mucociliary and clearance in the airways. An impaired mucociliary clearance in the airways and gas exchange in the alveoli, disruption and the maintenance of lung fluid balance is observed in the pathogenesis of a variety of lung disease and intervention that affect ion transport. And lung fluid balance are a point of therapeutic intervention to treat lung disease. The glands of endocrine system secrete hormones into the bloodstream to maintain homeostasis and regulate metabolism. The hypothalamus and pituitary gland are the command and control center in directing hormones to other glands and throughout the body. Other primary endocrine glands, including the thyroid and parathyroid glands, the adrenal gland, and the perineal gland, adjust the level of various substances in the blood and regulate metabolism, growth, the sleep cycle, and other processes. Organs such as pancreas also secrete a hormone as a part of the endocrine system. Secondary endocrine organs include the gonads, kidney, and thymus.
Gerontologic consideration. So, when we say gerontologic, it is the study of aging, including its social, psychological, cognitive, and biological aspect. Gerontology is rather than geriatric, which is medical specialty devoted to treatment and care of older people like mga senior citizens. So, there are many normal psychology changes of aging, including reduced cardiac, renal, and respiratory functions, and reserve the alteration in the ratio of body fluid to muscle mass. After older adults, response to fluid and electrolyte change and acid-base disturbance. Decreased respiratory function can cause impaired pH regulation in older adult with major illness or trauma. There are many things to consider with gerontologists. So especially the human organs become as we age. This organ will also diminish its function as well. This is the time when all organs will start to deteriorate. That's why others are so vulnerable to any illness. So, the response of older person to fluid and electrolyte imbalance may be altered as a result of aging, psychological changes. So, in elderly person who have experienced serious sickness or trauma, decreased respiratory function can lead to problem with pH regulations, renal function like muscles, mass, and daily exogenous. So, recreatine generation deteriorates with age. The concentration of bodily fluid in older person is reduced, which may affect psychological response. So, di ba mga mas, di ba if you're older na, almost of all our organs are diminishing and deteriorating. So, mag-iba na yung mga skin mo, magkunot na siya, parang ganun kasi nagbabago na lahat habang tumatanda ka.
Continuation of gerontologic consideration. Renal function declines with age. For example, awan kita niyo sakit sin kidney. Biya awan siya bato-bato halaw, dapat maig nato o para di siya malaggo. Especially to control our salted eat and chili. Dapat makontrol natin yung pagkain natin amon mga mix o and chili. Huwag natin pabayaan ang ating sarili kasi sakit ng kidney. Kailangan mag-exercise tuwing umaga, especially sa matatanda. Kailangan gamutin siya agad-agad. Dapat mag-exercise natin everyday para di siya malaggo amon sakit sa kidney yaon. Therefore, high normal and minimally elevated serum creatinine values may indicate substantially reduced renal function in older adults. So, maaari pahiwatig sa kalahatan binawasan ng bato sa matandang tao dahil sa isang bawasan sa age, muscle mass, older adults. Yung muscle mass is the amount of muscles in your body, yung tinatawag ng muscle mass. At meron isang lower concentration ng body fluid, maaari baguhin ng physiologic responses.